Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is a podcast about politics and intellectualism. On today's episode, I am joined by the writer, editor, activist, and the just elected new state senator from Pennsylvania, Nikil Saval. Before running for state senate, Nikil was a co-editor of the literary magazine N+1 and the author of the book Cubed, A Secret History of the Workplace. But for those of you who know me and know this podcast, you will probably know that Nikil also happens to be one of my very favorite design writers. Nikil's writing on design, architecture, and urbanism has appeared in the New York Times and the New Yorker, and has been, I think, some of the smartest, most thoughtful, most interesting writing on design over the last few years. He's written about subjects ranging from the Bauhaus to architecture of Silicon Valley, to brutalism, to Robert Venturi. I was curious to hear how this career might influence his new job in Pennsylvania's state senate. So in this conversation recorded right before the election, where he was running unopposed, we talk about all of that. This conversation opens with the intersection of his writing life and his activist life, but quickly moves through how he started writing about design and how design can be a subject that allowed him to write about so many of the things that he was interested in. We talk about how writing and editing are shaping how he hopes to legislate and how it's kind of influencing his new job, or how he thinks it will influence his new job, and why intellectualism has been such an important part of his campaign. This was such a fascinating and fun conversation for me. It hits on so many of the subjects that come up on this podcast, but Nikil's position brings a sort of new perspective to many of them. And he does a really great job, I think, of articulating design's position in the larger culture and why that's so fascinating to so many people. I am so honored to have him on this show and so excited to see what he does in Pennsylvania. Remember, Scratching the Surface is made possible because of listeners like you. If you enjoy this show and want to help support it, you can become a member for just $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter written by me, as well as previews of the upcoming episodes. If you like Scratching the Surface and if you want to see it continue, please consider becoming a supporting member. It truly means so much to me. For all the details, you can visit scratchingthesurface.fm/members. Thank you, as always, for listening, and here is my conversation with Nikil Saval. I want to kind of begin this conversation and frame this conversation. This perhaps is an oversimplification, but you essentially have kind of two sides to your work life, or two sides to your kind of public life. You have this kind of writing, editing, I'm sorry to use this word, but like intellectual side, and then you have this political side. You're running for state senate, or you just ran for state senate in Pennsylvania. You are an activist and an organizer, and I'm interested in how those two roles come together for you. Where do those start to overlap for you, and kind of how you think about these activities?
Well, it's a very good question, and I'm not sure. I would say so. I'm going to be a little bit discursive here, but so the way you put it actually is often how I did think about it. That I keep two sets of books essentially. That
Yeah.
on the one hand, I mean, literally, I'm books in the sense that I'm a writer and an editor, and and then at the same time I have an organizing life, and I've been an activist, and now it will be quite full time in the sense that I will be a full time state legislator, and that may change things, but until now, and it's today, I have to file pieces, I have to write things, and I have to organize, and I have to you know get out the vote here in Pennsylvania, and things like that. So um and in a way, I feel like insofar as this was a deliberate set of choices, and it is, they were and they weren't, I to kind of do both things. I i do feel like I did think of one as sort of absolving me in another sphere. So for example, I have never been, though my writing I feel is political or politically
Yeah.
inflected, and I've just never really felt that it was oriented towards social justice or to a particular cause, and so um and it might have been, I think, it maybe I might have gone in that direction, although it was never really my inclination. And
Mm.
so I did the activist work in a way, partly because I just was interested in it and it was satisfying and I found it effective and useful, but also because in a way, if I did that, if I was a labor organizer, which I was for a few years, volunteer labor organizer, or doing electoral politics, community organizing, neighborhood level organizing, I would do that, and then I wouldn't have to write about those things,
Oh,
or and so or I wouldn't have
interesting.
to. I I feel like I wouldn't need my journalism to do the things that I do otherwise, and so because I think some of the work that I do is, and I use this word not necessarily negatively, like elitist. I have this like,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
and so I write for like somewhat. I was a co-editor of N+1, a literary magazine that is among small magazines, is relatively popular, but is a small magazine, and so naturally it has a limited audience. It has, when I was editing it, it had about 10,000 subscribers, and um, so that's just not. I mean, it's a lot for a magazine of that kind, but not that many people, and so I could write about various topics, esoteric topics. I could treat them in a certain manner, and not feel like I was even though those pieces could be political that I edited or wrote, they didn't need to have direct political utility. And I think there's always that pressure on writers who are socialists or identify as on the left in some way. And because I had this other life. And so anyway, that's the beginning of an answer to that. And now obviously there is more, and they do inform each other, but in a way, what you're posing is actually how I've mostly felt, is these things are somewhat separate.
It's interesting to me, and I want to come back, obviously, and kind of talk about the Senate and your plans and kind of how that maybe fits into this. But I want to stay on the writing side for a bit because I know exactly what you're talking about as someone who has read your work for years, and even in preparing for this conversation, went back and read a lot of your work kind of back to back to back, and I think there is very clearly a political angle to everything that you write about. But I couldn't figure out, as I was reading these, I couldn't figure out whether this writing was meant to be activism, whether you were kind of trying to make change through the writing, whether this was just commentary, whether this was critique. I mean, you kind of move between these. And so I'm, to kind of go back to what you were saying earlier, I'm interested in if this side of your life was able to manifest itself in the organizing and in the activism, what was the goal of the writing side? What, when you are kind of filing pieces and writing, do you have a goal in kind of what you want those pieces to do?
I think I wanted, and I'll have to think of particular examples so that I can actually understand what I wanted from these pieces. But because it's hard to, in a way, it's hard to reconstruct, even though I presume I know my own intentions. But I always wanted the piece to think through a problem that nags me or I'm obsessed with, and so for example, when I was on contract for the New Yorker for a year to write a design column,
Hmm. Hmm.
which again, and maybe we'll get into this, but
Yep.
10 years ago, I would have never thought that that would be my life, but I was doing that, and so I wrote a piece on Uber and transit and city,
Right.
or rather
Yeah.
ride hailing, ride sharing, transportation network companies. There's a number of different names for it, but Uber, Lyft, that kind of phenomenon.
Hmm.
And I personally, as and politically, I have a strong desire to see that whole phenomenon come to an end. Like I
Right.
actually want,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
support the growth of transportation network companies, certainly in that form, and the politics of them I think are noxious, and so I I want it to stop. And so, but I know, however, that like a piece um like doesn't do that. It doesn't, like, I don't think I'm actually able, I don't know that I'm able to
Yeah.
do that
Yeah.
in an essay. I'm not able to, I'm not a muckraker. I don't, I can't just like slit the throat of $1 billion company with like
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
knife, sharp piece. And so what I instead wanted to do was just think through, like, well, why do I, what is the problem I have here? Like, why I like it,
Mm.
why do I, like, why does this company make me so upset and angry? Or why does this form of travel and transit? And so so that was an instance in which I felt like I actually probably did have a political goal, but I didn't, you have, and there, and it's somewhat articulated in that piece, but
Yeah, I think it is.
yeah. And so, and then, but maybe more obliquely, there, I wrote a piece also for the New Yorker about about Apple, and it was when Sir Johnny Ive, uh,
Yep. Right after he resigned or left the company. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly, yep, and it gave me license, and I quite indulgent, I think, like, to just be, to think about why I hated this, the objects that were coming out of Apple, or like the, especially the phone in particular, which I now have one. I actually did have one, and I wrote the piece.
Oh, interesting.
I had a flip phone, and then I ran for office, and it suddenly became just
Wow, I love it.
unfortunately. But it's, and so, maybe then there too, it's like, I'm like, I want the iPhone to end. I just want it. I don't want to need this. And that
Yeah.
like it even, whereas actually it might be the case that someone will like end Uber as it exists, or like, defund Uber or whatever, but like you won't, that's not going to happen to the phones. I mean, something not, and so, but also it was complex. I actually do admire I admire what is happening. I clearly recognize these objects as work, as design objects that are deeply considered and felt, and so I had to also express that part. And um, but and then
Mhm.
the other thing that I always try to do is to make these things social, and so like that's the
Right.
instance where uh, I not having a design background or training, I'm often trying to explain. I'm often trying to to explain things to myself as a
Mm.
someone who knows more about design than I certainly did, and maybe more than some people. But I'm trying to explain these objects and these practices, things like that, to someone like myself, who comes to them fascinated, and and perceives them in social life, like, and perceives them as part of their everyday life, which is necessarily inflected with how society functions at a particular point in time, what the history of capitalism is, or what the economy is like. So um yeah, that's how that's what I try to do in this.
I,
That
I
makes
mean,
sense. Yeah.
it's interesting that you brought up those two pieces, and I want to like talk about the design side of this in a second. But I think what you said is exactly kind of my reading of your work. To be honest, I think that Uber piece especially was the one that I felt of all the New Yorker pieces, that there very clearly was a point of view, very clearly was kind of a an agenda, I guess you could say. Um, and the Johnny Ive one I thought was one of your most kind of like straight criticism pieces. Like it, like you said, it was very pointed and direct, and you had an argument that you were making that I, you know, very much enjoyed. I guess as you're talking about this though, I hesitate to bring this up because I don't have the exact quote, but I remember listening a couple months ago to an interview with Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he was talking about how his essay The Case for Reparations had kind of gained more cultural currency since he had written it. And I hope I'm not misinterpreting his answer, but the interviewer kind of asked him about that, about how it's now part of the conversation in a lot of ways, and that, you know, half of the Democratic candidates running for president talked about reparations. And he said something to the effect, and again, I'm quoting him, and I hope I wasn't misinterpreting what he said, but he was like, I'm not, he doesn't try to write to change things. He writes so the people who can change things will read, like, hopefully read what he says, and that will help spark something. And that's kind of the way I kind of see your work. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, it does. I think that's right. I mean, and though the comparison I feel like
Yeah, yeah.
is very kind to me. I mean, Ta-Nehisi is a really really extraordinary writer, but I but the other thing is that, but yes, I mean, like, I at the same time that it's just shy of that. It's a little bit further away, and there is the case for it's a useful comparison. Just to take an example of someone who has influenced policy discussion without producing policy. That's the case for reparations is that, and it
Yeah.
people to understand the history of redlining and property and the black and white wealth gap and things like that. And but I I often write pieces that don't have that,
Yeah.
I mean, like, that's very obvious, but they don't have, um, they don't end with, like, a
Right,
real
right.
direction for what it is you want to do. I mean, I've written, architecture profiles for magazines, and that, I mean, and then for N+1, I think I maybe write more. I felt freedom to write some more pointed political pieces, but
Mhm.
yeah, it's sort of, I think ultimately I'm trying to I'm trying to understand a problem that is obsessing me in a particular way. So um
Right.
some of the, like, the closest, like, political pieces I've written for N+1, and some of these have been unsigned because we published these unsigned editorials at the very
Oh, right,
beginning.
right.
And so I wrote pieces about the Democratic Party and what kind of party it actually was, and how it functioned. And in a way, that was when I was getting involved and active in politics, and I needed some way of, you can't actually figure that stuff out as you're doing it. I mean, and so I have to stop and read about it, and think through the problems, and allow for some circumspection, and maybe I gesture at some point to what the
Yeah.
answer is, or what it is that we should do, but I try to avoid those injunctions, because I then I don't know, I feel like they can seem sort of apostrophic, maybe, like, where they're often, yeah, on the left. It's very common for people, especially like the socialist left, to say, to end a piece with some injunction, or, like, it's just like call to the working class to do something. And you're like, what? It's just, it always reads poorly to me. And I say this as an editor who is often editing these things out of pieces, where you're like, that doesn't, this is dishonest. It's not, you're not, that's not actually the odd, if that's your audience, only part of that audience is reading this. They're not, and you want
Right.
something to happen at the end of this piece that's not going to happen because you say it. And so, like, it's
Right.
it's dishonest. And so so I try to avoid those things in my writing as well.
So let's talk about design, because
Sure.
that's for many years is what I kind of how I came to your work. And I read you in the New Yorker and the New York Times, and you were this person who I thought was writing about design in a really smart way, and in a way that I felt like not a lot of people were. And in a way, kind of like what we're talking about now, you were making it social. You were kind of connecting it to larger ideas. You were looking at history and kind of putting it into a historical context. And as you said earlier in the conversation, you kind of came to design through a roundabout way. You feel like maybe you don't know that much about design. Where did your interest in design come from, or how did you kind of find your way into that beat for a while?
There is a long history to this that I will sum up very quickly, but I think the seeds for it were just moving to New York City when it was where I went
Mm,
to college. I went to Columbia in
mhm.
2001 to 2005, and um, at the same time discovered the kind of corpus of urban studies and founded an urban
Mm.
studies journal at the college. I had made a very good friend who was an architecture and urban studies major, and we just would take these walks around the city. And I sort of became interested in planning, design, but again, purely as an amateur. And the other thing is that uh, my wife is a preservationist, an architectural preservationist.
Oh,
So,
interesting.
she actually knows a lot, and so there are many ideas that we just kind of discussed, and I sort of I learn how to read buildings in a way from her.
Mm.
But although she does so with accuracy and skill, and I often
Right, of course,
don't
yeah.
really understand what I'm looking at sometimes. But the real thing that changed me into a design writer without my expecting this to happen was my first book, or
Okay,
so
yeah.
far only book, which is called Cubed, and it is a history of the office. It's office work, office culture, and office
Right.
design. And what happened with that book is I actually ended up writing. I wanted the seed for it. I wanted it to be a labor history of white collar work. I thought,
Mm.
as someone who had worked in an office, who and was just kind of alienated by the experience, and wanted to organize a union with my fellow publishing employees at some point, I just was like, well, why don't white collar workers have the same consciousness as say blue collar? I mean, this is put
Yeah.
very crudely, but as blue collar
Uh-huh.
workers have had. There aren't that many unions among office workers in the private sector in the United States. And why is that? And so I started to research that history, the split between mental and manual labor is in the kind of Marxist tradition. And but C. Wright Mills has a book called White Collar. And so I
Mhm.
wrote this like very long, sprawling piece that also ended up trying to figure out, that took as one of its moments in 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 white collar history the invention of the office cubicle.
Right.
And I was writing it for N+1, the first kind of seed article for this book, and someone just was thought, well, this piece is about the history of the cubicle. And
Mm.
I thought, well, it was not what I wanted to hear. I was like, I don't really want to write that. That sounds boring. But then it turned out you could tell a large part of the history of post-war capitalism by talking about what happened about the invention of the office cubicle and its what happened to it. It was meant initially to be this sort of flexible solution to open plan offices that was created by, people don't tend to think about this, but it was created by an inventor working for Herman Miller, one of the great
Right.
office furniture companies of the 20th century. I mean, it's still. And so, but then it became this box, and it became smaller and smaller as the economy became tougher and meaner in the 80s,
Mhm.
90s, and to the present day. And so suddenly I saw there was this connection between design and work and the economy, and
Mm.
that was my book for the large in a large way. And I could talk about the history of the skyscraper, and I'm not the only person to have done this, but just to unify all these, to synthesize all this information, to talk about cities. I mean, downtowns as features of American cities that are different from other cities, and
Mhm.
concentrations of white collar workers, to talk about design and power and the way that feminist organizers trying to organize secretaries used office design to help their cause. And um, that's a lot of what my book is about. And so when it came out, I thought, it could be read as a business book, which is actually how my publisher partly marketed it, and or as a book
Mm.
about the future of work. And
Right.
instead, what a lot of people picked up on was that I was an architecture writer,
Yeah.
and so someone was like, "I love your book. Can you review this new biography of Corbusier for us?" And I was like, I don't really know that much. I mean, like, compared with many architecture journalists and students and historians and stuff, I knew comparatively very little. But I thought, okay, yeah, sure, I'll do it.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so in a way, I sort of set on this path. But it was the book and then the reception of the book, I think, that
Yeah.
solidified that.
I mean, that's so interesting to me to hear that because I read the book and I remember reading it thinking like, yeah, this is a design book. This is a book about design. And I think hearing you recount that, and as I was preparing for this, I was having trouble placing when the book came out, kind of exactly in your career of whether you had written about design before. So it's interesting that that was the seed. But it's also interesting because everything that's in all of your other quote unquote design writing, I think, is in that book. And it's what you just said, that it is not just looking at objects or artifacts or buildings, but connecting those two questions of power and labor and feminism and, how the built environment is then kind of shaping the conditions of the people inside them, which is why I'm kind of so drawn to your writing. And so that's I guess like a compliment that I'm trying to turn into a question. um, I'm I'm interested in your relationship to the word design. I guess at a really kind of simple level. Thinking that this was a book that you did not think was a design book, and that when someone told you this is about the design of the cubicle, you were kind of put off by that, and then suddenly you find yourself being asked to write about design. And you had this kind of other interest as an amateur. Once you started writing about it, did this seem like a beat that you were interested in and that you could write about? Was this word design a kind of term that, I don't know, excited you, or felt like these other bigger questions you had, you could kind of filter through the lens of design?
Yes, yeah. That in fact, I you put it beautifully. I had never really been able to articulate it to myself, but I think that's certainly right. In the process of writing the book, and just it now is some distance
Hmm.
in the sense that it came out in 2014, but I wrote it, the better early part of this decade that's ending, and I, I the one of the things that was interesting in writing the book is I felt I had this. I feel like architects don't come off well in the book, with some exceptions, and so I don't feel that way anymore. But I had this great desire to deflate the kind of pretentious
Right, right.
builders
Yeah.
and things like that. But interior designers, I had this great admiration for, and I
Mm,
thought that even where there were mistakes or things that seemed to fail or go wrong, I really liked researching, like writing about Florence Knoll, for example.
yeah.
Um, and I think I just thought was a brilliant design. Like I thought was a genuinely great figure, and who deserves to be, the equal in our conversation with some of the with architects. And I think not to separate these two things out too much,
Hmm.
but I think that
Hmm.
the reason that I do is that, not not all architects were skilled at design. They didn't actually design a lot. In many cases, design the interiors of these offices, and so the people who dealt with people's everyday experience of the office were sort of interior designers or furniture designers um, or in some cases scientific managers. And so they were closer to people and had this kind of, as I started to look into to understand the profession. Um, it was this profession that seemed to permit a huge expansion of what it of its meaning, and
Mm,
what
mhm,
things
mhm.
counted as design.
Yeah, yeah.
And architecture, it's sort of clear what counts as architecture. But Charles Eames has this phrase, "Everything is architecture," and
Yeah.
so that I think is the kind of that I think is the ambition of, certainly, of 20th century design, and probably 20, and in some cases 21st century. I mean, I think
Yeah,
there's just
yeah.
a sense that if you were a designer, what can't you do? I think that sort of feeling is in such that, and that's true in the career of some of these figures like Ray and Charles Eames, where it's obviously furniture and houses, model houses,
Mhm,
and
mhm.
also films, toys, just kind of
Yeah.
considering the nature of communication. Then figures like Buckminster Fuller, like,
Mhm.
where you're like, well, what are you exactly? Like, and I think that's that,
Yeah.
you're planners, you think about housing, cybernetics. I think there's just this way in which it was the more I got into it, the more I felt like it was the nice thing about design is that it admits that kind of capaciousness. So it is
Yeah.
you have genuinely kind of fascinating people who enter into it and who are intellectuals of a sort. At
Mm-hmm.
the same time that it's always on the edge of like bullshit sort of.
Yeah.
And so it's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
and so you're like,
Yeah.
is Fuller a fraud? Maybe, like,
Yeah.
and at times and I think and there's just this level at which fraudulence is always around the corner, and
Yeah.
that part about it makes it like the fact that it is this kind of soft profession
Yeah.
in any
Yeah.
way, and like that's why I feel like it's great, and then there's some more obvious kind of issues like it are you designing for these object, like if you're a designer of if
Mhm.
you're an industrial designer, are you facilitating the growth of a consumer society, or are you an artist, and like all those
Right.
like
Right.
classic juxtapositions I think are nonetheless, I mean they're sort of, they might be a little bit old at this point, but they're not resolved exactly, and so I think they continue to be interesting in just every sort of instance, as well as of course the like design or artist. I think there's this
Yeah.
what's the Bruno Minari book? I think that he has the book about that. I mean, there's just
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and so yeah, so that's what got me interested in it. I thought it was another, and so as a result, you find that you can suddenly examine all these aspects of a society through something that you maybe might think not to. That's
Right.
like I so like you why not? Maybe you learn something different about the economy or capitalism or what have you when if you look at design first,
Yeah.
you start to look
Yeah.
at things through design.
I mean, it's very it it makes me feel good to hear you say that, to be honest, because I am a designer. I studied design, and so I kind of just naturally am bent to look at things through a design lens. And I think I've talked about this on the podcast before with people that I see everything from politics and the economy and culture kind of through a design lens, and that I have this theory um that all kind of cultural criticism is also just kind of design criticism. that
Mhm.
that design is the container that holds all of this, but I never know if I kind of think that, because is that the ego of the designer that you're talking about? um uh and so it's interesting to hear that you kind of think about it that way also. I have two kind of I want to go a little deeper on that question, but I have two connected questions that are probably a little bit inside baseball, but I'm curious to hear how you think about them. I'd love to hear about your own education in design. Once you found yourself writing about these things, were you were you assigned pieces and then you kind of went out and researched them and reported back, or were you also starting to consume this stuff on your own and kind of pitching these things? How did that kind of education, that kind of self-education come about for you?
I would say that it was a little bit of both. I think that the writing that I did about architecture, so like specifically, people who were architects, principally, and had architecture practices and built buildings for the most part. Um, that was largely assigned. I would say that someone would say the T magazine would say something like, can you write about Kengo Kuma, the Japanese
Mhm.
architect, or can you, and then in which case I would have to suddenly learn as much as I could about the history of 20th century of post-war Japanese architecture, or it was like, and
Right,
that was,
right.
which was great. I mean, I like, I had some inkling of it, but it was like this just, and I it's scary because you're like, oh, I gotta write this piece. But so I say the architecture pieces are more generated by other people, and
Mm.
then the kind of, then when it gets into design, I'm sort of creating those. I'm coming up with those ideas myself. And then for the New York, and it also depends on the institution.
Oh, right, right.
So for the New Yorker, I believe I came up with most of those ideas. I think that's right. I'm trying to think of an instance where it was an assignment. Oh, well, someone actually, the first piece I wrote for them, which was about the scooters, about
Oh,
electric
yeah,
scooters.
yeah.
Yeah, and so that was their idea, and I was thought it was a great one. But that's that it also is conceivable. I guess I could have come up with that one. It seemed like a normal or natural to me to write such a piece, and so
Mhm.
um yeah. So that's and then I was just reading around. I mean, like I wrote a piece for the Times about the OSS about
Yeah.
so
That's the one I was thinking of. That was what my next question was gonna be about.
oh, okay, yeah. So, well, do you wanna I mean, but that was
I mean,
what I came up with. I
yeah, that's kinda was my question because that was the one that I felt was different. I also think your piece about the Bauhaus was like this, where it was just so well researched, and I was like, "Is he just, kind of consuming this stuff on his own and pitching this, or did somebody ask him to read all of this?" Because those 2 pieces especially, just loved.
yeah, the Bauhaus one was it was like the anniversary of the Bauhaus.
Right,
That
yeah,
was
the centennial.
I would not hate anniversary pieces, and I would not I was very pleased to be able to write that one, but I would not have come up with that one myself. But if the Times is like, "We'll send you to Germany," I'm like, "Great." I mean,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, of
yeah,
course,
sure.
I'll go.
And so uh, and so then and I knew a bit, I would say, but probably not, like in a very, honestly, it was fairly cursory. I feel like my knowledge of the
Mhm.
Bauhaus, and so I just it forces the reading, and the Bauhaus is like the perfect instance of all the things that we're talking about
I was
because
just gonna say that, yeah.
yeah, it's like obviously the major figures associated with it are architects, but the point of the and then architecture took on this like increasing
Mhm.
role towards the end of it with because Mies was the last director, and so who was though Mies obviously did do furniture. He was an art, he was truly an architect
Yeah,
in this way, and
yeah.
so whereas Gropius or these sort of other figures were like at least had an idea that craft, design, folklore, all of these things, theater, all those things were a
Mhm.
little bit more part of the total spirit of the place, and so in a way it's like yeah, it's the perfect instance of all the things that we're talking about in terms of the fluidity of what design can mean, and that was yeah, it was just an opportunity at the same time that it took place in this extremely charged political atmosphere, and like
Right.
there's you're sort of hard pressed to find a more intense times like than interwar Germany. It's just like there's like in terms of like culture and politics mixing. All at once, and many different possibilities and foreclosed futures, and political parties literally crap like fighting in the streets, and or members,
Yeah.
and so that's there's it's like it's almost too much like it's a perfect piece, and so that was an idea that someone came up with, but I had great freedom in how I
Mm.
wrote it, and so for that I have to thank my editors and my editor at T, and the editor in chief of T, but um the OSS piece was my idea.
Okay, nice.
I had come across, there's a very great piece about it by Barry Katz, who
Yeah.
is associated with IDEO, if I'm not mistaken. And so
I
uh,
think so.
yeah, and but but it's a fairly scholarly,
Yeah.
and so I was like, and it's one of the only pieces to have looked at this OSS design or presentation branch archive. And so I
Mhm.
went and looked at it as well. And so I don't, in a way, I'm not fully sure that if you look, it's worth reading his piece. I'm not sure I improved it, but it's like, it was, yeah, that was my thinking. It was another instance where the arts of, you know, one, I think we maybe don't even think of it, not, and not we as in designers certainly think about presentation, but I don't know that
Mhm.
people
Right.
think
Yeah.
about presentation. And there's a little, maybe people have Edward Tufte books, and there's just like
Right.
there's not. It's like the notion that presentation as an art and as a practice like has an origin, and it's like it's being refined, and forms of abstraction are being refined in the context of this spy operation. I mean, it's just like it's kind of. I mean, it was difficult to figure out whether I still don't know if it's true to the extent that I claimed in the piece that it all starts here, or what. Like I think there's maybe an over dramatization of that, but it was, yeah, it certainly, it certainly seems to be like the right time when a lot of, and then when a lot of these forms of presentation are being pioneered, and like, and you have this government that is just interested in it, and so, or like this sort of like sub branch of government that is new. Yeah.
Right. I mean, so this is actually a nice way to start to kind of connect all of this back to the Senate and kind of this next thing that you're doing. And so for the last year, I guess you've been running for state senate in Pennsylvania, and we're recording this a few weeks, like 2 weeks before the election. This episode will come out after the election. You're running at this point. You won the primary, and you're running unopposed in the general election. So unless some strange thing happens, by the time people listen to this, you will have been elected to the state senate in Pennsylvania. I'm very curious how all of this kind of design stuff that we're talking about, do you have a sense on how that has influenced or perhaps shaped how you think about politics and how you think about electoral politics and how you are thinking about legislating?
Yeah, it has, and it hasn't, I would say.
Mm.
So the and I- in and so I'll get to the has part, but the hasn't part is, I maybe I'll say it and then I'll feel like it's not true. But the, so the has is like and maybe this is obvious, is like, I write about, obviously I write about design and the kind of like more in graphic, interior, uh,
Mhm.
like less obviously political side of design, which doesn't mean that it's not political. It's not so clear, um, but I do write about cities and city planning and housing
Mhm.
and housing
Yeah.
politics, and there, that, I mean, that work and interest has been, as it has had obvious relevance and importance for my ability to like talk about those subjects, to be sort of literate in them.
Mm.
And so, I had the support of a number of urbanists in Philadelphia, just because, not necessarily because I was always expert in the issues that they were expert in, whether it's transit or housing or zoning, but I just had a basic level of literacy and understanding
Right.
the topics. I knew the kind of relevant writers on a given subject, or thinkers, and could learn to understand it very quickly. And so that's been helpful, and it's going to be helpful. And it just, I'm just interested in the subject, and I think I'll be able to do a decent job in terms of finding
Mhm.
producing legislation on it. So that, I think, is, I mean, that's not so surprising, maybe, and it wasn't necessarily surprising to me. It was part of my pitch in a way. I write about housing and architecture with the New Yorker, and like someone, and that is not the most important thing, but it was not irrelevant. And so then the way that it hasn't, is in the sense that I feel like there's this part of me that is just interested in these things, and I don't know, I just don't know. I don't really know how they're going to be relevant. The only thing that makes me feel like the relevance maybe is just that it's like, I designers are sort of like, and especially in it's true at various times in American history, certainly, that design, like a designer will become the kind of epitome of what is considered creativity in the country, you know, like, and, the
Yeah.
Eameses were this at some point, Fuller was this, it's, you know, at a certain point. In Italy, actually, like Ettore Sottsass, and like there's like these sort of figures
Hmm.
where they just do everything, and they like, you know, there's even this film called Executive Suite, which is like a was like a oh, it's a
Oh, I
film in
don't
the
know this.
50s, and like it's not at all very good, but it's like, but it was a big Hollywood film where like the main character is basically based on Charles Eames, and like his office is meant to resemble like
Oh,
Eames's house, or the Eames's house, and like it's and he's this designer who's fighting the like the takeover, the restructuring of his company, and so it's creativity versus big, like, bureaucratic business
oh,
in the sense, you know,
interesting.
anyway, there's like and I think Ive and Steve Jobs, to the, you know, to some extent, had this aura to them. And you know, and so that, to the extent that that's, you know, not wrong, like I like there is something like because design is, and I still meet designers, and I'll just be like astounded at like what they know and how they can see, how they can solve things. Like, I think, like industrial designers will just be like, will just try to they'll just try to make something to like solve like an issue, that's they have mice in their house, and so they'll just try to create this like elaborate camera system to understand where the mice are coming from, and I'm like, why would you go to this trouble? But that's just what your where your mind goes if you're trained in the field. And so I'm actually thinking of a real example of a friend of mine who did this, but they, and so like, you know, I guess that example of like someone wanting to be creative about facing up to the social problems in their society. And this is like, this can have a banal, I think, design thinking, for example, is like a sort of
Yeah. Yeah.
banalized version of this. It's not terrible. It's just like it sort of doesn't fully capture what
Right.
design how designers think, you know. And I think that's like, and so, you know, in a very vague way, I think like having that example, like you want that someone, when faced with a particular problem, uh, you know, doesn't, if you're a designer, you don't, your profession is fluid enough that you're like, you don't really always know what you're gonna do. Like you're like, and if the problem is like, I'm a designer and I'm faced with like a major issue facing a city, you're like, you're gonna have to be creative and withhold um, judgments and things like that. So I'm putting that cautiously, because I don't know if that's, I've never really said that, and so I don't know if it's, or thought it, and so like I don't know if it's really true that I think that. I'm just like, or that's how it's affected me, but that may be um, part of it. And the last thing I'll just say, and this is not about design, but this is about my literary training, but that the one thing that has definitely proven true, but I did not know that it was going to be true, is being an editor has been truly useful. Like not
Mm.
necessarily a writer, but an editor, in the sense that I often had to edit pieces, you know, and frankly, you know, frequently about architecture or design, where I would not know the subject, I couldn't write it myself. I would need to find a writer, and to find the right kind of writer, I would have to do a lot of research and figure out who that person was, and then I would, you
Hmm.
know, I have to figure out what the right questions were to ask about that piece. And when I got it, when you get a piece and you're an editor, you have to be kind of pseudo expert about
Yeah.
it, and so you then have to learn a lot very quickly, and that practice has made like crafting policy pretty helpful. So I was able to assemble a good policy team, and you know, it's a similar process. Like if I'm like, to find, to like get a housing policy, like I'm not going to really write it all myself. Like I'm going to work with people, and fundamentally it's going to be a team that drafts it. And so that
Right.
was similar. It was a similar process to editing a piece. And so if someone else is trying to do the thing that you want done, but you can't quite, you're not going to do it yourself. And how that proves useful in legislating, I think it will, but I guess I haven't done it yet. I don't
Do you think writing about thing, I mean, you have policy proposals around housing, around transit, around the Green New Deal that you have also written about as a design writer, all of those subjects. Do you think approaching those through a design lens, through your writing, I don't know, like, gives you a better understanding of it or a different view of it now kind of being on the other side where you actually can start to kind of enact some of these things? Like, is there something about that design lens that you feel has been helpful to you in understanding these issues and thinking about these issues for yourself?
I don't know. I don't know the answer. I wish I know that's sort of unsatisfying. I the one thing that has been true is actually maybe that not being trained as a design writer or as a design historian, not actually even being trained as a historian.
Mm,
So there's ways in which I approach some of these subjects without prejudice or without preformed opinions, and so they lead me in certain directions and to certain ideas that, like, I don't know if I'm going to put them into practice in legislating, but they've got to be interesting in some way. So I'm like writing. I have to write it now because I'm giving a lecture about it in a week. But there's a there was this moment in 1965 actually when the poet and but also architecture sort of writer June Jordan um, collaborated with Buckminster Fuller to produce a plan for Harlem. It was born out of
right,
the
right.
after the Watts Rebellion. I mean, I'm sorry, not the Watts Rebellion. Excuse me, the rebellion in Harlem in 1964, and they produced these sort of giant. They look like nuclear cooling towers, just spaced throughout
Yeah.
Harlem, and I but like the projects are meant to be mixed use, and although barely describes what how mixed their use is, mega towers
Yeah.
in which that are meant to kind of take people out of what was perceived to be very claustrophobic and choking
Right.
space in Harlem. And so I don't know that I'm gonna like want to like, and it's like an amazing moment where like you won in terms of architectural history, where I think we should be writing in more figures like June Jordan and thinking about them as architects in the same way, or designers in the same way that we tend to think about them as poets or writers or journalists, and equal in some ways um to the figures we usually talk about but
Mhm.
for me, it's like just thinking through those issues, thinking through the history of like urban rebellion, black design, and I'm I don't think it's gonna it's I feel like it's got to be useful. I don't it it's just I don't fully know how. Even though we're not, it's like I'm never going to say like, yeah, this is what we should do. But but that knowing that there were moments when people thought like this and they opened up possibilities that like kind of there are intimations here in that project of Afrofuturism, and um, that seems like useful to know and useful to feel connected to as a legislator. But I don't really know how. Like I just feel like it's but maybe in the way that you just want to be alive to the kind of possibilities that aren't normally um, aren't normally part of legislation or politics, and like that's in and the hard part is actually it's just there's not you lose a lot of time for that kind of like digging I mean, like, I'm already losing it. I feel like where I don't really
Right,
have
right.
I'm not able to like think deeply in quite the same way, or just like look around and peer around and 'cause that's it starts to
Mm,
feel indulgent, and it shouldn't. It's yeah. I think that's what
yeah.
happens. Is like politics can be, especially when you're like you're not just expected to legislate, but you're like expected to I spend so much time now doing social media, which I didn't even do. I didn't have a thing. Like, I had no Twitter, I had no like nothing until I ran for
Right.
office. And now I have to kind of like register my day on platforms, and that takes away like a lot of time from just
Yeah.
other things. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that because I wanted to ask you about something that you said in another interview. You were interviewed in GQ during the campaign, and you kind of talk about really how we started this conversation about the kind of intellectual writing side and the organizing side, and you talked about wanting to run a kind of unashamed intellectual campaign. And you said, I'm going to quote you for a second. You said, "This right wing strategy to denigrate what is supposedly, quote, highbrow political speech, I think has been internalized by people across the board. That diminishes the point of what we are trying to do. Socialism points upward. We want more people to have access to all cultural goods, including the widest spectrum of linguistic resources." I love that idea. Um, I think that's exactly right. I think that's also kind of a design question. Also, like, I think design at its kind of purest, most noble form is a type of socialism that is making things available to everyone, kind of, allowing everyone to kind of take part in this. And I'm very curious how you are thinking about reconciling this, uh, now, essentially being in politics, being a legislator. How does that intellectual side come back? How do you maintain that space for kind of the deep thought? How do you then communicate that in a way that's not dumbing it down for people, but is kind of elevating everyone to this kind of level of discourse? And then like the side question, I guess, to that is, do you think you'll still be writing? Like, where does this kind of other side, does that still have a place?
Yeah, so we're gonna have to find out on the just on the writing side. I did write. It's funny. I was asked to write a piece, and it will, I believe, have come out by the time this podcast aired, about
Mm,
Pennsylvania politics. And it's actually like difficult and sensitive because I'm writing about
yeah.
something that I'm writing about people I know, and or or even if it's obliquely or not by name. And so you suddenly have to be much more careful, and because you're a public figure in a more serious way. And so I have there's ways in which it becomes more difficult. But but which doesn't mean that I can't. There are other subjects that are not as sensitive that I hope to be able to write about. Not because I have to. I mean, I also need to I write because it's my job, and so I feel like to make money, and now
Yeah.
I'll have
Yeah.
like a real salary for the first time in years, and so
Mm,
I do hope that there's room for that, and to explore subjects in a complex way, which gets to the other part of the question. I mean, I one of the writing that politicians tend to do is are op-eds, which I've done. It's a form that I just despise. Like I'm not very good at it. I don't. It's a really degraded form of communication. It doesn't,
yeah.
for all the reasons that we were talking about at the beginning of this, which is that you are trying to make a you are trying to just get a point across, and you really can only make one point, an op-ed, and you just have to you just have to get something done. You have to and you have to advocate for something, and sometimes that's the right thing to do. I don't really want to do a lot of those, and if there's if like I can consider the housing question, um as in its complexity, or um or things like that. I think that would be I would still welcome that opportunity. And so in terms of just the issue about complexity, I mean, like, one, it's personal to me as someone who does political organizing,
Yeah.
and will often write something or say something, and someone will point out that what I'm saying, like, I've used like a fancy word when I don't have to, or something like that. And
Yeah.
sometimes that's true. Sometimes I am actually just indulging a habit that is like pointless. Like I've certainly written emails that where I just in a pure editorial sense,
Yeah.
you don't need to do, like, it's not the apposite word to use. And so I do that, and people pull me back from it. But I usually actually hear these complaints from people who are they're like, "Oh, you're shutting out so many people by writing or talking this way," and and it's like this kind of
Mm,
pseudo. It's this sort of elite anti-elitism, because it usually comes from other people who have the same levels of like overeducation or what have you that And
Right,
in some ways
right.
maybe have like a much higher class background than I come from. I don't My parents are immigrants from a poor country, and I didn't grow up with money. They ran a pizza restaurant. I mean, I didn't
Mm-hmm.
it was like, and so and I grew up speaking, two languages. Like, it's not it's I sort of feel like that, yeah, my resentment is coming through. But, like,
Yeah,
I
yeah, yeah,
so and also, but more importantly, like, it's who I am. Like, I can't change. I ran as who I am, and like I think you do kind of negotiate who you are in when you're a public person, and you change that, and you do have a public presence that is distinct from who you are privately. And I
mm-hmm.
can't, but that's what liberal society is. You have a public self society, a public sphere and a private sphere. But um, I can't. It's sort of disingenuous and pandering, I think, to suggest that
Yeah,
like
yeah,
to try to be someone that I'm not, and to suggest that people aren't desirous of, like, just wanting to hear someone be who they are, or like that they aren't desirous of, like,
yeah,
education or whatever, like, whatever happens to be. I mean, I just don't think that's right. To go back to have a design example for this, like, the kind of tribune of all of this is William Morris. I think a great figure from
yeah,
England,
yeah, yeah.
uh, one of the founders of the British socialism, a Marxist, who designed tapestries and expensive furniture, and had an issue. He was like, "Oh, I have this problem. I'm design. I mean, this is a very simplified version of what happened, but he was designing luxury goods, and for people,
Yeah.
and but at the same time that he recognized the kind of degradation of the arts, what more generally, eventually found the cause to be capitalism. Like, and so but he nonetheless wanted to continue to produce this work. He still wanted to produce, like, books, and the Kelmscott Press, and like the Chaucer,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and I think that's right. I think that's actually, like, the right. You want to change the society, and you want that to be accessible. In a way, our society is often not elitist enough and not democratic enough. It's not that. It's I think those two things are somewhat separate. That's true of our university system, such that it used to be the impulse to be like, we're going to have these great universities, and they're going to be free.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and that's the and you know and that's how we create access, and that's how we enlarge the audience for what was bourgeois culture, or aristocratic forms of culture, or whatever. And then something changes as a result of our society. But that's how I tend to think about it, and I still I, and that's sort of who I am.
Do you think? I'm not asking you to predict the future or to kind of make guesses or anything, but I'm hearing this and kind of talking about this. I'm thinking obviously of Hofstadter's anti-intellectualism in American life. I'm thinking of Kurt Anderson's recent book Fantasyland, which I think was kind of about this in a way. I'm even thinking strangely of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who,
Hmm.
in a way, I think kind of relates to this as someone who was, very uh, unashamed intellectual, who was also kind of writing about cities. Now that I think about it, and it just seems like that kind of politics isn't. I don't mean to be so negative. It's almost like not possible. Like, let me phrase this as a question: is that possible? I've now shown you my cards, but is how do you do that today when most of your day has to be spent promoting yourself on social media? Like, how do you get back to something like that, or do you have thoughts on how you're at least hoping to retain some of that?
It's difficult in terms of the resources of time. Like, that remains. Just that, one, I'm reading, not necessarily reading less, but reading books less than or like, at a less steady clip. And actually, I think some of that can be just regimented and changed. It's not like, you actually, it seems like Barack Obama was always, like, quite a voracious. And so it's not. I think a lot of that is just your discipline, and, like, not allowing yourself to just, like, tweet or whatever late at night, or whatever, I don't know, whatever I'm doing, but like or to work past a certain hour. Um, but also I actually feel like it's slightly easier in the sense that than I would have thought, in the sense that there's just like on the academic side of things, I would say that there's much more commerce between the sort of left wing academy, or just, or that's even kind of a crude description, but just like this, like between the academy and politics, and there's more socially oriented work being produced. Like
Mm,
I know a lot more scholars who are quite savvy politically, and I work with constantly, who are sociologists, and
yeah.
a lot of my housing platform and education platform is produced by people who are landscape architects and planners and sociologists who like do stuff at Penn Design, like at
Oh yeah.
the Penn Design School, and they're on the one hand totally immersed in like a certain form of scholarly inquiry, which is itself under threat, but that's its own. But at the same time that we talk all the time. The ideas are exchanged. We do Zoom events. We do like, hopefully in-person events at some point. And like I'm able to like learn and keep abreast of things. And again, that actually helped. It partly goes back to, again, my training as an editor, where like I I had to do that all the time. Like I had, as in you also as an editor are constantly like, well, what's new? What should we be talking about? What's like, and that's exhausting to some degree, because it means that you have to have this kind of like, you're always monitoring something, like,
Yeah.
and so, but it means that you are thinking a lot. And so,
Right.
yeah, I mean, in a way, the side of me that's like, the side of me that got there is a part of me that is just interested in some of these subjects as in ways that like Nietzsche might describe as like antiquarian. Like
Mm, hmm.
like I'm just interested, and I know it has no political relevance, and so like I play, I'm a classically trained pianist. I like music.
Mm.
I want to just be able to like, I'm more worried about maintaining those interests,
Yeah.
and just being like, yep, like I'm gonna like spend this evening like listening to Don Giovanni or something, and like reading some music. I don't know. I'm really revealing like my true elitist inclinations, but like it's like
Yeah.
I've said too much. But the the like, or whatever, I'm just like, I'm also interested in like modern, just I'm just interested in, in literature and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's stuff that's like really has no obvious utility. And frankly, some of the like design history, where you're like, it's not clear what my like reading about, the various like
Yeah.
German Werkbunds that like formed before the Bauhaus, like what does that have to do with anything? I don't know. It's like, but I'm interested anyway, and so.
Yeah. That I know exactly what you mean, and it actually leads perfectly into my last question. But I'm the same way in that a lot of my, especially in regards to reading and reading habits, as my work has moved more into research and writing and editing, I'm finding that my reading time is going towards reading for research, which fortunately for me are subjects that I'm interested in. But I'm also a big fiction reader, and I love reading novels and literature. And, I kind of, the thing I'm struggling with now is when I get quiet time to read, it's like, do I read this design history, which I'm going to be interested in, or do I pick up this novel that I would actually want to read but serves no purpose other than pleasure? And so I know exactly what you're talking about. And my last question, which you mentioned you're not reading as much as you would like, but the last question that I used to end all of these episodes is, I'm curious what you're reading right now.
Oh, I'm reading Persuasion, Jane Austen's Persuasion.
Oh,
I'm actually, which I'm sort of embarrassed. I have a PhD in English, and so it's a little bit embarrassing
right.
not to have read this, at some point. But I've never read it, and it's a phenomenal book. I just, no, in case people didn't realize, Jane Austen is like is a genius, and so that's what I'm that's what I'm reading. And actually, and during the campaign, I've made like a point of just reading things that I felt were pretty were I was interested in under any circumstances, but were like had no value. So before that, I read The Power of Images in the Age of Augustus, which is just a classic art history book, or I understand it to be classic, about the change in iconography and imagery and architecture under Augustus. As like
Yeah.
like like rationalizing what was like the or legitimizing the regime change from the Republic to the Empire. Anyway, it's a great book. But right now I'm reading Persuasion.
I love that.
Like I should read it much more quickly because it's funny anyway, but it's great.
Yeah. Nikil, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Like I said, I am a big fan of your writing, and I'm so happy that you've made it to the Senate, even if I'm a little bit sad that we might not get as much design writing from you. But I enjoyed this conversation so much. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It was really a pleasure.
This episode was recorded on October 19th, 2020. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.